All right, we welcome you to another episode of Learning Stories. This is a show where we interview a diverse set of learners from the 21st century. In each episode of this show, we profile a guest who has a story to share about how they acquired a set of skills and knowledge in a creative and innovative manner. In the process, we hope to uncover a new understanding of learning as conceptualized, imagined, and narrated by the guest in our show. Today's guest, Michelle D. Costa, has many hats. She is a human resource professional, a poet, a literary editor, a podcast host, and also a passionate creative writing teacher. A little bit more about her background before we jump into this conversation that I'm really excited about. She was born and raised in Bahrain, Gulf is her debut publication that was released by Yavnika Press in 2021. It is a poetry chapbook, and I will post a link to purchase a copy of the book in the show notes that you can review right after. She co hosts one of India's top book podcasts. It's also an author interview podcast, and the title of that podcast is Books and Beyond with Bound. Her fiction and poetry can be found in several journals like Litro UK, Bourgeois, Out of Print, the Bombay Literary Magazine, and many more. Her poetry was longlisted for the Toto Award for Creative Writing in 2021. She loves teaching and mentoring writers, and in addition to this life as an editor and a creative writer, she also completed a Bachelor of Commerce degree from Mount Carmel College and a Master's of Business Administration degree from Christ University, post which she worked as an HR professional in the Middle East in a couple of companies. So there's a lot to unpack there. Michelle has had a very interesting and wonderful life, and there's so much that we can unpack in this conversation. But Michelle, to get started, I was reading through the review that Jane Borges wrote about your collection of poems. Congrats for that. To start off with.
Thank you. Yeah, and thank you for such an interesting introduction. I'm glad that you found all of that interesting.
I mean, there was so much to put together there, but I think you've led the life, so you know so much more about it. But in that review, I found it really interesting that there were a couple of things you spoke about how we read about a lot of memoirs that come from North America, where people talk about their life in the West, especially South Asians going and setting up their life in that country and writing about that experience. But what I found refreshing about your poetry chapbook, and there was a short poem that Jane actually put up in that review, is that experience of an Indian growing up um, in the Gulf was something that there's a big vacuum for that sort of worldview. So just to get started, Michelle, and that's how we normally start the Learning Stories interview, is what was Michelle like growing up? And for someone that knows nothing about the Gulf, what was it like growing up for Michelle in Bahrain and in Oman?
Yeah, oh, in Bahrain. Yeah,
Yeah.
correct. So Oman, no, just Bahrain.
Okay.
So yeah, for me, I think growing up there was it was interesting, to say the least. I will always be grateful for our. So I studied in Indian school, and I'll always be grateful for our school library because that was my only, exposure to literature. Right? I did not have. I mean, I still do not have any readers or writers in the family. They're more of oral storytellers. So my parents keep telling me anecdotes from the past and all of that. They love sharing stories, but not through the written word. Right, so that was entirely new to me, and I remember going to the library and borrowing Nancy Drew, Goosebumps, Sydney Sheldon. Of course, I was, I think, too young for Sydney Sheldon at that point, but I think that was my first exposure to literature, and I'll never forget those days. I'll always be grateful for that. Of course, later on, as I met writers who've had better backgrounds. So for example, people who've had libraries at home and probably read the classics and could quote from the classics, I did wish that our library would have been better, but I can't complain because Abhishek, for me the Gulf felt like this place where there was a very limited scope for literature, right? English writing. If you notice, there were books by British and American authors. Like it's quite common, right? So Enid Blyton and all of them, J.K. Rowling, which I mean, very good writers, very good books, but I mean, there's a very limited exposure. So so later on, so those were my growing up years, and if I can add a bit to that, I felt pretty well below average in school. I was always just an average student. I didn't probably feel very much inclined towards academics, and all of my friends were multi-talented. They were amazing. Like, either it could be sports, it could be singing, dancing, whatever, you name it, they were amazing. And I always wondered, what am I good at? I loved that validation, that feeling of, getting a trophy, getting a certificate. And I never had that. I remember I had participated in, I think, a drawing contest, a sketching contest, and they had given me a participation certificate. And I felt so happy. But then again, I was like, okay, but I didn't win anything, right? So am I really good at sketching? So I think this is something that kept running around in my mind, and I always wondered, what am I good at? So, just before passing out of school, that is, I think, in my 11th grade was the first time when I thought, okay, let me try. If I don't try, I would never know what I'm good at. So earlier I had tried, I think, a singing contest. Earlier, I think I tried sketching, as I told you, but it never clicked. I had stage fright. So I was an introvert. So nothing worked out. But then just before passing out, I participated in our a writing contest, and I won the second prize, and that was it. That validation kind of gave me this signal, to write, because I loved stories. I figured that around 6th, 7th grade, that I really loved stories, but I didn't know whether I could write any. So that was how I think I ventured into writing.
That's amazing. I mean, you speak so passionately about your love for writing from a very young age, Michelle. But I'm curious about just building on what you said, Michelle. What was your experience in some of the other classes? Because I'm trying to understand how did that inclination to study a particular subject eventually develop at university? What was your experience in the math class like? What was your experience in the science class like? What was there anything about these subjects that you were interested in? Also, like growing up as a young girl in the Gulf, uh, what would you do in the evenings once school was done? And just to give people a picture of life in the Middle East, but also maybe of your favorite teachers and other people that had an influence on your thinking growing up, including close family members.
Yeah, thanks for asking that. It's quite interesting because I will never forget those teachers who encouraged me, right? So we had an economics professor, and he, by coincidence, he was also De Costa, but not a Mangalorean or a Goan. He was from Kerala, but he was an amazing teacher. Like the way he decoded economics, rather, the way he explained, for example, supply and demand, something that can be very complicated to ordinary people. He made it so simple for us, and I just loved that. I loved his passion to teach. And I remember people used to just students used to run and wait for his notes. They would literally copy his notes. There was this frenzy to get his notes just before the exam. So he was our teacher. And apart from that, in maths classes, oh god, so I still have this phobia. Sometimes I get nightmares of not turning up for a maths paper or something like that, or not able to complete it on time. So I did not like maths at all. I remember I always I used to go for tuition. So if you ask me what I did after school, and I would spend the rest of the time in tuitions, because I realized I need help with maths. So I think in my 10th grade, I came across this teacher, and I again will never forget her, because she was one of those who was non-judgmental, right? I have met teachers in my life who are judgmental. So we had this math sir. Of course, I won't name him. I don't remember his name also, I guess. He taught us maths in the 11th grade, and I think I failed in the test or something like that. I scored very less, and he asked me, he said, "What's your performance like in other subjects?" Because I think he was curious, and I said, "I'm okay in other subjects. It's just maths." And he said, "Okay, but you need to work harder because it's clearly not reflecting." But yeah, maths has always been this bone of contention. But yeah, so there was this tuition teacher I came across, and she made maths fun. Like, I couldn't imagine maths could be fun. She broke it down, be it dry subjects, or complex things like algebra or trigonometry or whatever, and I used to love it. That's a different thing, that it didn't translate to marks. I freaked out in the boards, and that really brought down my percentage. But what I can say is I loved learning when I was with her. When she taught, I think she taught me for 3 years. But I will love that atmosphere, mainly because she was not judgmental. She broke it down as if I was a child. Like, you're explaining maths or the concepts of maths to a child, and I really like that approach.
Interesting. And what are like, yeah, I mean that's so important, right, Michelle? Because sometimes like our early experiences with a subject can actually influence our perception of what that subject is. And when we make decisions about choosing a particular stream or choosing a particular profession, we often turn back to our experiences in, a particular classroom to say if we
Yeah,
can, do those particular pathways well. But, apart from
exactly.
the
Yeah,
sorry, yeah, apart from the academic side, Michelle, like for like because I grew up in the Gulf, and what I found really fascinating about the initiative to write that poetry chapbook was the title of the book was The Gulf, right? So for
yes, yeah.
for someone that hasn't grown up in the Gulf, what are five things that you think kids that grow up in the Gulf have that other kids don't really have,
Oh,
or
wow.
something unique about their experience in the Gulf?
Oh, very interesting. I don't think anyone has asked me that before. In fact, for a long time, I thought Gulf students had this had something lacking, because
Right.
because from what I used to hear, so when I went to Bangalore for the first time to pursue my higher education, I kept hearing, oh, Gulf kids are so privileged, Gulf kids are dumb, and I'm like, what? I have never felt like that, but I think what they mean is, Indians were more street smart, or they were more competitive by nature, right? Because of the crowd, because of the population. So, I mean, of course, I can't stereotype, or I can't say five things, that Gulf kids probably have, because I think I led a kind of a different life. Like, I mean, I was an introvert, so I didn't really hang out much with people, but I do know that there were some Indian kids who always went to clubs, right? So we had these ethnic clubs, Mangalorean club, the Goan Singers Club, and all of that. So I do know that some children had a more social life. So I can say that yes, it might their personality might have been more rounded had they gone out. So, but one thing I'll say is the Gulf has everything. A lot of people think, especially Bahrain, they think it's like Saudi, and that's something that myth I've tried to bust through my writing, right? So, whenever I meet anybody, first thing, they always say, "Oh, how's Dubai?" I say, "No, I'm not from Dubai." The Gulf is not just Dubai, right? There are many places. And the second thing is, it's not like Saudi. So what I'll say is, if somebody wanted to explore different sides to themselves, there were opportunities. It's just that I was an introvert, and I probably didn't make the most of what was available. And later on, when I went to college, that was the time when I really accessed those sides to me. But otherwise, I'll say it was I would say, very privileged life. Like, I'm blessed to have grown up there. My parents have, tried their best to give me the kind of life that they envisioned, and I'll always be grateful for that. Because I mean, only after speaking to people do I realize that not everyone, has probably been blessed with all of these things. So I'll always be grateful for that.
Yeah, and I completely relate to that, Michelle, because like I grew up in the Gulf in the same school. We both went to the same school as well, and I think you
Yeah,
graduated a couple of years before me. But I think what was unique about my experience in the Gulf was just this idea of always trying to understand my identity in that world too. I was watching another movie recently about the immigrant experience in Australia, and the character in that movie was South Asian and was actually from India, and she said that we're always stuck in this world where we're not. Uh, we're not Indian enough to be Indian. We're not Australian enough to be
Yeah.
Australian. We're in this middle space trying to find out if we're part of this world or that world. And I think
Yeah.
that like a term they use for that is a third culture kid. A third
Yes.
culture kid that navigates both these identities and you know tries to understand that world. But I completely agree. I think it is a in addition to being a comfortable life, it's also a life that has its own pressures and challenges, right? Most of
Yes.
our parents were professionals over there, and they had their own jobs to look after, and they tried their best to give us a comfortable
Yeah.
life,
And
which
and
was
if And if I can add to that, so the job security is something that only I understood later, right? So because in the Gulf, you don't have a visa, right? You have this work visa, it's a contract, it renews for 2 years. And of course, growing up as a kid, I didn't understand. So, even when my parents would come on vacations, right, to Mumbai, they were constantly on calls, and I used to ask my dad, why are you on call, you're on vacation? And then he said, no, but what if I get replaced? And I never understood that, but apparently that's a thing. They were really worried about their jobs, that's why they worked, I would say, harder.
yeah.
Otherwise, I mean, had they probably been in a country where they were assured of at least a citizenship or whatever, it would have been a little better. So this was something that I didn't probably realize when I was growing up, but now it makes sense to me.
True, and that point you actually brought up about citizenship, it's different from moving to maybe North America, where people get an opportunity to transfer their residency into something more permanent. In the Middle East, it's very unlikely, or it's a lot harder to convert. Like for instance, my family stayed in the Middle East for over 20 to 25 years, but it was a lot harder to convert that into an actual citizenship. And a lot of our parents, spend so many years in a particular company. um, I mean, there are financial rewards, but you don't have that actual certainty of staying in that particular place. So I think that is another experience that is unique to an immigrant. And in that sense, I think I remember listening to a talk between you and Tara about the migrant experience on the Books and Beyond podcast, where you spoke about the. So, what is the difference between a migrant and an immigrant, Michelle? I know you brought that up in that conversation too.
Abhishek, can you give me 1 minute, please?
Yeah, sure, no
Just
problem.
1 second.
No problem. So while Michelle comes back, just to give you a little more about Michelle's work, Michelle has a really interesting literary journal, and I will be posting a link to that. The podcast that she hosts, they now have 4 seasons of episodes. It should be available on most podcasting platforms. So, and I've spent a lot of wonderful hours listening to episodes on that podcast with authors like Amitav Ghosh, um, and I think they have a stellar collection of authors, Manu Pillai, Amitav Ghosh. So do please check that out. And again, I'll link that in the show notes. But sorry, Michelle, I was just giving them a little more about your journey. But
Yes.
Michelle, that difference between a migrant and an immigrant, because I think that plays a very important role. I mean, that theme is represented again and again in your writing, and I wanted to
Correct.
break that down a little more from your perspective.
Right. So that's something I did not know earlier. Because I have been thinking a lot about this, about who is a migrant or who is an immigrant, because I've been Googling a lot of writers who are, migrants. I mean, this is the definition that I came across, is that an immigrant is somebody who leaves their home country and then eventually makes another country home, right? So they settle there, right? It's rarely, I would say, that they come back to their place. So then I realized that we are migrants. I mean, Gulf, the people who go to the Gulf. Why? Because you always return home. It's rare that you get to call the Gulf as your home, right? Eventually, I would say, where you settle. So it's more like we're temporary people who go there, migrants constantly moving, and then you're always back to your home country. Like it could be any place. I mean, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, India, whatever. So that is the biggest difference. A migrant is somebody who eventually returns to their home country.
Interesting, yeah, and I think that even the understanding of the expat community in the Middle East, I think our experience was limited because we were surrounded by people that were primarily from South Asia, but there were,
Yeah.
immigrants and migrants from other countries like the UK, the
Yes.
US, that actually, called the Middle East home as well. So, and I think that's really interesting to understand. But, Michelle, I'm thinking about that transition. Now, you've spent like over 18 years in Bahrain, and I know, so why did you decide to study what you studied at university, and what was the thinking that led up to that? Because one of the reasons we do this podcast is to, try and understand how your thinking has evolved over time, right? So, I mean,
Right.
why the choice to study what you studied, and why did you choose that particular city that you eventually decided
Yeah.
to settle down in?
Mm, okay. So I think never wanted to continue studying in Bahrain, and this might sound funny, or it might sound very snobbish, but this was what I had heard, that only failures stay back. I mean, seriously, that's something that I kept hearing, and I said, "Oh my God, but I'm not a failure," you know, like. It was really weird, Abhishek. Like if I think about 11th and 12th, right, the grade, even choosing the commerce stream, it was like a hierarchy, right? So there was science, then there's commerce, and then there's arts. And I kept thinking to myself, oh, at least I'm not in arts. Can you believe it? Like somebody who loves arts so much, I said, okay, at least I'm not among them, because the kind of things that people spoke about them, it was just so bad. They said that, oh, those are all failures just because they couldn't make it into the other stream. They were, the lesser intellectual people. It was really bad. Okay, so that was 11th and 12th, and after that, it felt like a natural progression because I'd chosen commerce in 11th and 12th. I definitely knew I wouldn't want to do science. I liked biology. That's something I loved out of all the three streams. Physics and chemistry, I could never ever get the concepts right. And I was very curious about how others learned. So we had some family friends who took science, and I think I asked one of them, how do you memorize, or not how do you memorize, how do you understand chemistry equations? Because, they were really, really long equations or whatever. And he said, oh, I just turn it into a song. And I found that so creative, like I never thought of that. Like, I mean, he definitely had an inclination towards science, but then he also said that, see, you can't learn in a robotic manner, right? You will eventually saturate. So then he used to turn it into a song, but then I knew that I would never uh, manage science. So I didn't want to just take it for the sake of it and then, drop out and all of that. Commerce is something I thought is okay. It's fine. It's definitely way better than taking humanities. So, gosh, it was so funny. Anyway, so after I took that, I did my BCom because it was a natural progression, like I said. But and how I chose Bangalore, I think it just happened because Bombay didn't seem to have a very safe kind of uh, residence for women. Something, when we spoke to a lot of cousins and all of that, they said that, okay, we might have paying guest accommodations, but there are not many hostels for girls. So my parents, said, because they're sending me for the first time to a different country, they said, okay, might as well you go to a place which has a good hostel facility for girls. So then, when we spoke to cousins, they said, why not Bangalore? Bangalore is pretty much like Bombay, good, good education wise. I mean, it's really good and all of that. So it just happened. I got admission in Mount Carmel, but because of the fact that it was not just a commerce college, right? It had science, arts, and all of that. I was able to speak to other people who were very much into the arts, right? So there were students whose parents were journalists. They were, much into this, like from a very long time, and it was really fascinating. I loved the contests. There were lots of contests. So I think earlier, I got, like in school, I did not participate in anything, and now I got out of my shell. I said, if I don't do it now, when? When will I? So even though I took commerce, I will never forget my English teachers, and they tell me that they will never forget me. The reason is because they told me that the students that they had in their English classes, right? I mean the humanities courses. Apparently, they said, some of them already knew everything. So it's kind of like, the classic you can always read on your own. You can always understand on your own. You don't need someone to teach you. So it was kind of like they didn't feel appreciated in those classes. And I would just go and harass them all the time. After class, I would be standing outside in the, teacher's room, all of that. And I would just, I don't know, I was just shameless. I was so hungry to understand, what a piece meant, like an English text meant. And like you said, in school, which subjects I liked. I loved English. I always loved English. That's something I realized I loved, but I couldn't, I didn't have the tools to express that love for it. And mainly because I didn't know what I could do with English in the future. That was the main thing. Because I know that my parents were very hardworking. They told me that you need a job to sustain yourself. And I knew that English kind of doesn't translate to those kind of opportunities. So yeah, but I think it was in college where I really, really started writing, started writing and gaining feedback. So I kept hounding my teachers for feedback, and it was lovely. I would never exchange those years for anything else. It was really, really interesting. Yes, there were times where I thought, okay, why, I should have probably studied literature, but then I obviously wouldn't have had the path that I've had so far. So it would have been very different. Yeah.
Oh yeah, and I think that what I've noticed about you, Michelle, is you're extremely curious, right? And I think that is something that defines your personality. You always want to know more about the world. You want to, and I think even then that was very prevalent in your demeanor. And so once you were done with your Bachelor of Commerce course, which is a course in the commerce field, so what did you do right after that, and how did you eventually end up taking up that next degree?
Oh, I actually took a gap year, just like you.
Okay.
But when I read your interesting, experiences throughout your gap year, I felt like, oh my god, I wasted my time. So I didn't really do anything. One thing was I wanted a relaxed year actually. So the thing is, because I was away from home, and I wasn't eating well. The hostel food sucked, as you can expect. So I wanted to take this relaxing year and figure out what I want to do next. So my parents were very supportive. They are the ones actually who suggested a gap year, and they said, just chill, just relax, see what you want to do. So I did a couple of internships in HR, because that's something I realized that, again, in BCom, there are, like, accounts, there's business, there's a lot. I liked HR out of all. First,
Okay.
because it's a theory subject. I prefer theory subjects, and I realized that that's something I like. I like talking to people. I like knowing about people. So yeah, so then in my gap year, I did a little bit of writing as well. I think I did a lot of writing. Yeah, actually. So it was 2012. That was the time when I figured out the whole world of literary magazines. So honestly, if literary magazines weren't around, I don't know if I'd been writing today, because I honestly didn't have any kind of guidance, right? Like, otherwise someone tells you, okay, this is how you should write, this is where you should submit, and all of that kind of. So it's kind of like figuring out the ABC. So I would spend hours reading literary magazines, and then I would look for volunteer positions, right? Like editorial positions. And also, what I figured was, I probably will never do a course. I can maybe learn on the job. That's something I was very keen on doing, right? So I applied, and there were very kind people who gave me chances, and that's something that I think I'm eternally grateful for, because it's just through these experiences that I've learned, be it writing, be it editing, or all of these things. So yeah, I think that's what I did in my gap year. And then I toyed with the idea of doing literature or even psychology. That's something I was interested in. But then again, thinking about the job prospects at the end of the day, I did my MBA. So I went back to Bangalore, but this time I studied in Christ University, and it was very tough. In fact, they had like 5 rounds of interviews or whatever, and you have to write your cat and mat and all of that. So I did that, and yeah, and again, very, very interesting experience in my MBA. It was very hectic though. It was a trimester system, which was something which, like three months. So you don't really have that space to I would say understand the concepts and then apply them, like you have in a semester system. So a trimester system, I figured, is very, very hectic. And apparently they did it for a purpose. They said that if you're able to handle this kind of pressure, you will be able to handle pressure at the workplace. So apparently that
Sure.
is the idea behind the structure, and all of that. And again, there were a couple of teachers who, when they came to know that I write, they were very supportive. So I find that quality very interesting. because even with my parents, for example, what I mean is, if somebody knows where you're coming from, or if somebody has probably had a certain kind of worldview of the arts or something, I think it's easy to support that. But these people, they really did not have any idea about writing, and usually they think writers are, they don't make anything of themselves, they are very erratic people and all of that. And yet they supported me, so that's something that's always stayed with me.
Yeah, and that's amazing, Michelle. Like, like, and I think there's a beauty to also learning anything in life, right? Any knowledge that you
Yeah,
learned is
exactly.
useful in the long run. And I think, when you think about some of the subjects you would have studied in commerce and the MBA program, at the undergraduate and postgraduate level, a lot of these subjects, can help you understand, the world, the way the world works, in terms of how business organizations work. What are the processes that need to be put in place to make sure they have a day-to-day stability? And whether you take it up as a profession, having that understanding actually helps you, understand the world a lot better, because the principles, the first principles you learn in economics, accounts, or HR, they can be translated across contexts, across the world. And I feel like that is definitely something, that is really important. And again, I think what's really interesting about your journey is that every profession has something beautiful or important to offer the world, right? It's about how that aligns with your value system in terms of what you think your role in the world is, right? So again, in this conversation, we're not trying to we're not trying to reverse the hierarchy in terms of setting another thing on a pedestal. It's again, like, we're trying to, like, and and I feel that's really important, that conversation about the possibility of having uh, a variety of ideas of what it means to be human, right? And and maybe when someone listens to this story, Michelle, about how you navigated this story, I think there will be a lot more certainty that there is the other pathway possible as
Yeah,
well, that you have navigated without too many references when you started. So maybe someone that is interested in the same pathway can actually look at your journey and carve out a path for themselves. So you did work in an HR role for a couple of years after this, right, Michelle? And um,
yeah, yeah.
what was that experience like for you?
Yeah, so, and if I can add to that, there's one advantage of studying something apart from writing or literature, and this is something I want to advise. I mean, anybody who wants to be a writer, right? One reason is that it's always a backup, because I mean, I'll be very honest here. There's not much money in writing, not much. I mean, pretty much not at all. So what I mean is, it's not a discouraging thing, but at least until things get better, you can always do it as a freelance. You can always be a freelance writer, you can always do it on the side. But if you probably look at it as your only option, it might not be great if you're looking to earn a living, right? If that's something that's you're very focused about, if you really want to stand on your feet, I would say please be a little realistic. And if you have another degree, it's always a backup, that's all. And another thing is, one thing that I realize now is that any kind of experience, like you said, you shouldn't diminish it, because as a writer, I think it's always material. Otherwise you're constantly looking, like, what should I write about next, what should I. But if you've had lived if you have lived experiences, if you've met different people, spoken to different people, that definitely gives you a different way of looking at things. Yeah. So actually, after my degree, I had a tough time. I went back home. I went back to Bahrain. I did not want to work in India, because I was kind of homesick. I was missing my parents.
Well, it's
So I thought, okay, let
interesting.
me.
Before you go ahead,
Yeah.
Michelle, it's interesting that you said home was Bahrain, right? And you are from India,
Yeah,
but you said home was Bahrain, right? So you still have
right. Oh,
that
okay.
notion of
Yeah.
home being Bahrain at that point.
Yeah, I
But
didn't realize that. Yeah, yeah.
keep going.
Correct. Because I think home is where family is. For me, that's always been a, thing. Like if they were in India, probably I would have thought India is home. So, I wanted to go back home. I wanted to be with them. Like I wanted to be with family. And so I went back, and I had a very tough time finding a job. So this was a very rude awakening, because I was told if you have an MBA, you will get a job, but it wasn't easy at all. It was a recession time in Bahrain. Actually, it was in 2015. I think, yeah, it was in 2015. It was very bad. And no matter who we spoke to, everyone said, oh, had she done finance, oh, she would have got a job so easily. Or had she done marketing, she like everything except HR. It was really funny, Then yeah, so there were like, I think I spent 8 or 9 months without having a job. I think I did some internships. Then finally, there was an opening in the newspaper actually, so GDN, right? And I just applied because I was just losing my mind sitting at home, because knowing that my friends were placed, they were already into jobs, so I didn't want to waste more time. I became very anxious, and then I applied, and then I worked there for quite some time. It was a very interesting role. But then I had this at the back of my mind that I've studied HR, right? There's always, you have this thing because you've spent 5 years doing a particular course, and then you wonder what now. So then I got into an HR role. I was lucky. Then probably things opened up. So it was a generalist role where I could do like different things. So there's recruitment, payroll, basically all aspects of HR, and I had a lot of fun doing that. Yeah, so I worked there for 3 years. And but one thing I'd like to say is what you study in theory is very different from what it is like in the workplace. You learn things on the job,
Yeah.
really. Like, what I mean is you don't have to have a degree in HR to probably, it's not like probably rocket science to crack it, but you'll have to understand how a corporate works. It's more like people management, more like temperament, where you'll have to learn how to also be diplomatic. So I kind of struggled with that. I'm a pretty honest person, so I learned to understand things better. How do you work in a corporate? How do you tackle, because HR was always like this middle point, so we had to kind of navigate the management and the people, the staff. So it was a very good learning experience.
And it's nice that you took up both these career pathways at the same time, right, Michelle? You took up the editing thing for some time, and then you took up the HR thing. Because I know, like, in addition to working in that HR role, you were probably constantly reading and writing, on the side, and
Yeah, yeah.
using.
So my work used to end by 5.
Yeah.
And the moment and actually I was looking forward, I mean, I keep looking forward to that, 5 p.m. when the clock is going to strike 5, because that kept me going, because I
Mhm.
had a good work life balance. I'll say that's one good thing about the Gulf. So when my work ended by 5, I would just come back, and I knew, my books were waiting for me. I would read, I would write, I would also watch a lot of films. So I am a big sorry I'm a big cinema buff. So I love watching films, or TV shows, anything that has a good story, and that kept me going. So I didn't really have a social life. My friends left, and they came back to India or different places and all of that. So it was just me and my writing and my reading and all of that, and that sustained me.
Got
Like,
it.
even if I didn't probably find that fulfillment in my job, I was so happy because I had the space and time to do what I wanted to do after that.
Interesting. So, what were some of the books and films that you saw that you'd recommend to, a lot of the
Mm,
viewers? And again, you can actually go back in time and maybe list out three books and
yeah.
three films uh, that have really, shaped your thinking. And it doesn't have to be
Hmm.
for writing; it could be thematic, or it could be anything else too.
Right. So there is some Iranian movie that I would want people to watch. It is, I mean, if you're into watching foreign films, so I love watching foreign films with subtitles. Of course, I don't understand many languages, but I love watching subtitles. And I mean, I love watching films through subtitles, and I also like observing the body language, because sometimes you don't need to understand the language that much. You can just observe and understand. So there's one movie called A Separation by Asghar Farhadi. So he's a very famous Iranian filmmaker, and I love that movie. I love the way I kind of, I'm drawn to domestic stories. I don't know why. Families and stuff about home, all of that. So I really like that, especially because it covered class very well. Again, it's, as you said, there are certain themes which keep coming up. So I love, stories about home, about class, where they explore class differences very well. And this was a different culture, right? This is in Iran, so it was very interesting to see that. Um, so that's one film. Another, I have this book beside me. I keep rereading it. It's The Revolutionary Road by Richard Yates. So it's a movie, also by the famous Titanic couple. So it became huge, right? I mean, adaptations don't usually make it that big, but then this is a very famous adaptation. But I want people to read it or watch it, because again, it's about this family. it's about these interesting dynamics between the husband and wife, and all of that. So that's another one. Another book that I already recommend is Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro. So if you like sci-fi, if you like speculative fiction, it's not really speculative fiction because that turns off certain other readers who don't like sci-fi. It is a very, very interesting story about three friends, actually. It is just about that. It's about friendship, it's about love, it's about very ordinary things that, people can relate to. So I like that. I don't think any other. Yeah, I have another book by my table. This is The Sense of an Ending by Julian Barnes. Again, an amazing book. Wow, like this, I was totally mind blown by his use of language and philosophy and all of that. And it's a very thin book. I mean, you could finish it like quickly. So I'll recommend these. Of course, I have like a huge list, but right now I think these are my top recommendations. But apart from these, Abhishek, what I recommend everyone is to read and watch South Asian work, right? Indian writers, Indian works, because if you keep reading white authors, if you keep reading only Booker Prize winners or all these things, you won't really understand how your culture, how your identity can come into play, right? So to just give you a very simple example, I grew up playing with Barbie dolls, right? And Barbie dolls back then were white, they had blonde hair. And I always felt, why do I look different from these? Like, I just kind of thought, like, I should look blonde when I saw these dolls. And now I'm so happy to see that, like, Barbie has evolved, right? The franchise, you can see dolls of various ethnic um, experiences. So yeah, I think the world has kind of improved, stepped in the right direction. So yeah, I would recommend people reading South Asian authors. And for recommendations, you can definitely check out the podcast, like you mentioned, Books and Beyond with Bound. We've interviewed lots of Indian writers, Pakistani writers as well. So yeah.
Yeah, I think you make some very very important points there, Michelle. Like listening to you, like even talk about the books that you really enjoyed. Again, Asghar Farhadi, someone I've really appreciated for a long time. I know he studied drama when he was at university, and I saw a couple of his other films, and he's just a brilliant filmmaker. And I'm going to look up the books that you suggested as well. I was looking for some new fiction recommendations, so thanks for that. But I've always looked at fiction, like this is just like I'm just adding on to what you said, Michelle, as a way to extend your experience of life. And in addition to, like, because I studied literature, I actually did literature at the undergraduate level. I love reading
I
literature.
so envy you, Abhishek, for
I
that.
mean, it's interesting.
That's awesome.
Like,
Yeah,
if you think about it, you would be someone that actually practiced what what I learned in terms of, so your pathway is more applied in that sense. So even though I study it, I do teach it at a more basic level. But I think what I really wanted to say was that I love reading fiction for language. The beauty of how different parts of speech come together to form a sentence. Why the person created a particular sentence? Why is it not a simple sentence? Why is it a complex sentence? And even the punctuation sometimes tell you something about the character, right? In terms of why was the pause there? And this is why I really like reading fiction aloud. Because because I teach it, in grade 5, whenever you read fiction, you notice that each character has a different voice, right? And if you ask a
yes,
particular reader to read a story, the way they represent that character's voice is also very unique to them. And
exactly.
I
Yeah,
feel like that relationship is so important. Is that what do you bring to the book as a reader, right? Because you are co-creating the story with the author and the characters in that story, right? And because your experience growing up in a particular place is as important to the evolution of this story, because in this story would mean something very different to you. Because if you think about the idea of let's say loss or grief, like the way like Michelle processes grief is very different from the way like Abhishek processes grief, right? And I think what authors try and navigate, I think the really good authors, what they do is they don't tell you or define things. They present an experience and they leave it for you to interpret what that experience is. And I feel like sometimes when you see someone experience something in a book, for instance, you read a love story, you also experience some of those emotions that those characters are going through. I know in your brain there is this particular neuron called like a mirror neuron. Like when you see something, you're actually, feeling the same thing as well. So I'm pretty sure that happens to, each one of us. And I know, and because you write so much, right, Michelle? Like what I've always noticed about really good writers is that they're also very good readers, right? So because you've read for such a long time, like you're such a competent reader, how does someone read well? Like when you read a book, what are some of the things you do, and what are some of the things you try looking for? How do you start, navigating the story? And this is also for someone that is not really interested in reading fiction as much. How would you build it up for them and give them some suggestions to get started on that journey?
I think this is the most interesting part of the podcast so far for me, because I mean I can talk about fiction for hours, right? It's my favorite form. So I would say, see, it for me, the curiosity to read came out of the need to become a writer. I think mainly, like what I mean is, my reading evolved because I wanted to be a better writer. So I started reading things closely, right? And because I did not have a background in literature, also. One second.
Yeah, no. Again, I'll be putting up the recommendations that Michelle shared in the show notes. So please do look up those books and films in the show notes. Also, you can follow Michelle on Substack. She writes a really nice newsletter called Mish's Muse, and she talks about books and films that she's seen. Sorry, Michelle, go ahead. I was just telling them other things they can explore in your writing, but yeah, go ahead.
Give me 1 second.
No problem. No problem. Sorry, while Michelle's just okay, Michelle's back. That's awesome.
Yeah. I'm back. So sorry about
Sorry,
that.
Michelle.
Um,
Can we
yeah,
go 10 minutes about the time we've scheduled for this, Michelle?
yeah,
I
yeah.
I,
Sure.
I don't want to take too much time from your day as
No,
well.
no, no. Sure. It's
Perfect.
fine.
Let's.
Yeah. Yes. So, as I said, see, I evolved as a reader because I wanted to be a better writer. Okay, and because I did not have a background in literature, I had to learn by basically practically seeing its application on in the text, right? So, for example, as you said, every character has a different voice. I wanted to see, for example, how does a writer do that, right? And I could only do that by seeing examples. So, for example, what I did was. I'm because of the internet, because of opening up of all these connections, I just reached out to writers. So when I would read the book, and of course if they're alive, and I read contemporary work, so I pretty much, most of the writers are alive. I would reach out and I would just ask them questions. So that's how my journey with interviews started, actually. So I would just ask them questions about the craft, and I would be like, how did you do this? Basically I was trying to learn. Okay, and that was the aim behind it. I was very curious about these things, and these questions kept running around in my head, and I thought, okay, why not ask them?
What were
They were
some of
very
those questions that you asked them?
so for example, the first author that I interviewed was this African writer called Tendai Huchu, and I'd come to know of his work through a magazine. So we were published in a magazine together. And I read his book, and I found it very interesting that he had certain icons in the book, right? So you have the text, and then he was trying to explain the game of Pac-Man, the game we used to play back in our days, and there were these actual icons of the Pac-Man there. I found it very curious, very interesting. I thought, okay, I wanted to know, for example, what was his editor's reaction? Did you just was it something that was welcomed? Right, because I wanted to know that apart from text, can you add other things if you were trying to show, for example, now we have GIFs, we have emojis. How do you portray that on paper? So I mean, my doubts could be anything, but I felt like if I asked them, and if they probably gave me, a reply, I would be satisfied with that. So my interviews are usually very long, and it's kind of like the authors are just like, oh my God, Michelle, shut up. But I ask them whatever I want to, kind of like I'm curious about, for example, is it maybe from their life? I mean, if it's probably a painful, traumatic experience they're writing about, is it something they've experienced, or It could be anything. I was just, curious to get the answers. So yeah, and so for tips for others to read well, I will say, see, always start with something you're comfortable with, right? So I began obviously reading things that I could read back then, right? Like Goosebumps, Sydney Sheldon, all that. Please don't feel intimidated and think that, oh, if somebody is probably reading Ayn Rand or of, more intellectual stuff, or that people consider intellectual, do not, I would say, be hard on yourself and try to read that just to fit in, right? Just find your path. I think the key is to keep reading. Never stop. Never stop reading. And I think evolving is something that, maybe not every individual has, right? Like you said, maybe some don't want to read as much of fiction, or maybe somebody doesn't want to become a writer. So for me, there has been a certain path, because I've clearly, known that I like fiction and I want to evolve as a fiction writer. But for other people, I'll say, just read whatever you can. Don't have this kind of mindset where you can only read certain things. That is the biggest drawback, I feel, where you constantly judge the kind of writing, where you think, okay, this is not the kind of work I would be interested in. Sometimes you'll be surprised what things really, what you learn, right? So I remember this experience from college. I was doing my MBA, and I didn't pretty much like most of the subjects, but then we were encouraged to write papers. So they said, if you have research papers, it adds to your credentials. So I remember doing a paper, researching for a paper. I wanted to focus on creativity, and actually through education. Okay, so the reason, I'll tell you why, is because we had a lot of group activities, right, where they would group us in 5 to 6 people. And it almost always happened that they would stereotype a person. Like, they would say, oh, Michelle, you're the quick one, you write this down. You are the organized one, you write all the points down, or whatever. And you're the creative one, you think of ideas. You're the logical one, you come up with the numbers. And I always felt like, why? Like, how do you know I'm just this? I could have other abilities. And I felt that was very stifling. So what I did was, I did a little bit of research, and I found it very like, the things that I came across were very interesting. I don't think I would have come across them had I not read those books. So I read books about learning. I read books about, there was a book called The Woman Who Changed Her Brain. I'm not sure if you've come across that, but it was a woman with some learning disabilities, I believe, and she was constantly told that she would never learn. I mean, she would never grasp concepts that others did, and she challenged herself. And literally, what she was trying to say was, you can change the wiring of your brain. You can rewire things, the more different experiences that you have. So that was a very, very interesting experience that I had. I would have ordinarily not gone for those books, right? Like I said, I love fiction, but it was through that, that I understood a lot of things. So there was another thing that I came across, was the Six Hat Thinking by Edward de Bono, where I don't want to obviously go into the details, but it basically allows everyone to think using a different hat. And I think that allows people to see that there are different sides to yourself also. So yeah, so I would say, be open to other genres. That will definitely help. For example, let's say food writing, right? You might not, I mean, it might not be something you naturally pick up, but if you read other things, it sometimes gives you ideas that would ordinarily not come to you.
Yeah, that's so true, Michelle. Like I feel like I had the same journey that you had, Michelle. Like about, so when I started reading, I was really into sports when I was in high school, and my one of my teachers gave me a book about the autobiography of a cricketer. And I was like, you can read books about cricketers, and I was like, wow,
Yeah.
this is amazing. And so I started reading only sports books, and the first book that I really got me hooked on to reading was this book called Born to Run. And I think that in that sense, our reading habits are also, I really enjoy fiction, but I prefer narrative nonfiction. Like a
Yeah.
story created around, even historical fiction is something I really enjoy. But like even that relationship to authors, Michelle, building on just what you said, like I struggled a lot with Shakespeare. We do Shakespeare very briefly in high school, in the school system that both of us were in. But you know my relationship to Shakespeare changed when two things happened: when I learned more about him, okay, number one, and when I saw his writing in performance. Because somebody told me Shakespeare was written to be performed. And also the language. I think there were three things. It was, so when he wrote, in the time that he wrote, Latin was actually the more popular language, right? And he was writing in a language that was not as popular. So he was actually someone that was not very recognized in his time, right? And the beauty of his language is he writes in iambic pentameter, right? And to maintain that rhythm for the whole play, I think that is like amazing in terms of what, and I think as a poet, even you probably write in certain, and I think what poets do there in terms of maintaining that meter, which we can't go into too much depth in. I think Shakespeare did a really good job in that. But I think the most important thing that changed it for me was when I spoke to another actor who was doing a Hindi adaptation of one of Shakespeare's plays. And I think I saw one of these plays at like a theater in Bombay, Prithvi Theater. And he told me that
Yeah, Prithvi is really famous. Yeah.
it is, yeah. And he told me that when he's reading the play, he tries to make sure the character that he's playing, he imbibes all of the qualities. And he's not always remembering the same dialogue. You know, he's innovating along the way and creating his own dialogue depending on what the director let him do. And then I started watching more of Shakespeare on the screen. And then I was like, wow, this Shakespeare is actually really amazing because a lot of his plays, whether it's Hamlet or Macbeth or Romeo and Juliet, they deal with themes that are universal, right? They are easily, which is why you see a lot of Shakespeare adaptations in other languages as well. And I didn't appreciate him as much when I was in university, and it's more recently that that relationship actually evolved. And I think that evolved because, as you said, it's really important to be patient with as a reader as well, right?
Yeah.
Start off with books that you're comfortable with and build on from there. So, Michelle, there are so many questions I want to ask you, but the last question that I'll probably stop here with, and then for more, to actually understand Michelle's thinking, I'd really recommend continuing with the Books and Beyond podcast and also looking at her Substack newsletter and the literary magazine that she like authored that is available online. I'll put all of that in the show notes. But Michelle, you've done 4 seasons of Books and Beyond, and this was after your career in Bahrain. You actually
Yes.
now. So, can you tell us a little bit about this role? And once you tell us a little bit about your role at Bound, maybe tell us what you learned about writing by interviewing so many authors in these 4 seasons. I think there are more than 40 episodes, which are an hour long each in these four
Yeah.
seasons. So, what did
Yeah.
what is your role at Bound, and what did you learn about writing by talking to all these writers?
Hmm. Okay, so firstly, I think people will be curious, from an HR role, how do you jump into a creative role? So I'll say it happened by accident. I knew that we are leaving, my parents were retiring and coming down to India. And I was very anxious about looking for HR jobs because I knew there's a big gap between HR jobs in the Middle East and in India, right? You need a different kind of skill set and all of that. I was really worried about it, but then I came across this vacancy and I applied. And like I said, I was always into the arts, so luckily that worked in my favor. So yeah, I mean, it's been it's been the most amazing time of my life. The kind of work I've done in the past 2 years, I don't think I've done ever, because you know how relaxed the kind of work life is in the Gulf, right? Over here, it's pretty different. So I've had a very creatively stimulating, also very exhausting. Like, I mean, I wasn't prepared for the kind of demands a creative job has, right? So it is very demanding, very, because you have to think of new things, and at the same time, there's, I mean, quality and quantity at the same time. So yeah, and the podcast is kind of like a dream come true, because as I told you, I love interviewing writers, and so it just began because both Tara and I love books. She's been an editor for many years, and both of us just started talking, and we were wondering, what does India lack? India lacks, I would say, just a plain conversation about a writer. But they're just giving you that kind of respect, kind of understanding what is your support system, right? There has been no support system for writers, no infrastructure. So it began from that, and it's, yeah, we are 4 seasons old, and it's been a lot of fun. About writing, what I've learned is, one thing is, Abhishek, rejections are very common in writing. And that kind of validation that you get when you speak to another writer and when they say, hey, I've been through the same thing, Maybe I've not learned something new as per se, because sometimes, when you're much into the job, what I've realized is when you're into a project, when you're doing things might not be very clear to you, right? Usually I understand things in retrospect, so maybe 2 3 years down the line, I'll remember these episodes and understand, oh, like certain bit from a certain conversation might come to mind. But one thing that I would say has helped me is the validation, the fact that the journey has been very difficult for writers, the fact that you keep going at it no matter what, even though there are no probably no monetary benefits or whatever. So that is something that I would say I loved. And I generally love reading, as you know, so that's an excuse to read for the podcast. So I've read different kinds of authors that I might not ordinarily read. So reading them, researching about them, and then discussing them. So it's kind of like buddy reading. I've always wanted to have a buddy with whom I could read the same book and discuss. So Tara has been that buddy reader for me, and it's a lot of fun. And more about my role. So my role is not just this, but it's pretty much a lot of things. So there's a lot of people have this misconception that my role is just reading and writing. It's not that. It is sales, it's management, it's coordination, it's I would say it's getting things done, right? Because a lot of people think editors do only this, right? But my role at Bound has always been a more wholesome thing. It's a small team, right? It's a startup, so it's more like getting things done, making things happen. So yeah, I mean, there have been days which have been very hectic. Now I have a more relaxed schedule, but I've had the time of my life in Bound, and I will suggest everyone to do internships. I mean, in general, if you want to figure out whether you like such a thing, I mean, you can only learn so much from others' experiences, right? Like, I mean, you might hear about my experience and think, oh, it's amazing, or you might think, oh, it doesn't sound that great. But unless you do it and unless you figure out for yourself, I don't think it really works. With anything in life. I mean,
Yeah, and kudos to you for being so brave. I think that transition to India actually allowed you to make that change. But I think you
yeah,
you always were open to making that shift, and I think that is really amazing. For anyone trying to, and I think it also shows like your journey, Michelle, shows that it's possible to make these transitions. Like
yeah,
keep reskilling, and no knowledge is ever wasted, right? Because a
yes,
lot of your, I mean, you really fed into that experience of growing up in the Gulf, and also your experience in the MBA and the Bachelor of Commerce program actually helped you in your current role as well. In terms of understanding how the business works, and maybe even in future roles, right? So that's really amazing. I know we're out of time, Michelle, but to end the podcast, we haven't ever done this before. I was wondering if you'd be open to sharing one of your poems, if that's possible.
oh,
Maybe like a
okay,
maybe not even one that's in the collection. Maybe something that you've
okay,
It doesn't have to be a poem. It
um
could be like even something you've written that you're comfortable sharing.
okay, I'll have to look for it now on my phone.
That's okay. Take your time, and we're not like in a hurry. I mean,
Okay,
if
okay, sure. Yeah, yeah. And if you probably want to ask anything else, I think we can, like, 5 more minutes, or if there's anything, I mean, you
Sure.
want to
Yeah.
ask.
Yeah. Let me just like we can take a couple of moments to actually reflect on everything we've said.
Yes.
And while you're looking,
Yeah,
I'll
yeah.
think of another
Sure.
question. Sure.
Sure. Yeah. Yes. So, this is a poem I wrote recently. And I so I've been thinking about the climate, the climate change and all of that recently. I've also read, sorry, I recently watched an adaptation called The Suicide Shop. It's an adaptation from a French book. Okay, and it's set in this post, severe climate change world and all of that, and it's very depressing. I mean, I will not recommend it to people to watch. But what I find interesting is there's a lot of engagement with climate change. Writers respond to climate change very differently. And I recently wrote a poem because there was a call for climate change poetry. So I just wrote it, and I've been thinking about it a lot more. I We also spoke to Amitav Ghosh for his book The Nutmeg's Curse on our podcast. So that's also made me think a lot about that. And I live near mangroves. In Mumbai, and I'm constantly surrounded by birds. I wake up to their calls, and it's a very, I mean, nature. I'm surrounded by nature, so that has made me think a lot about it. So I've written a small poem that I like to read out. Was published online, so it's called "How to Take a Lizard Seriously." Okay, so there's a lizard outside that closely watches everything and everyone. How the sky has changed color on Diwali, how the trees have disappeared to make space for the metro, how we still use plastic in many ways, how humans want offsprings despite knowing what we are getting into. The lizard is at a safe distance from us. Only when it gets inside will we do something. As lizards are known to fall into open vessels, they are supposed to be poisonous, or so our ancestors have claimed. We are yet to test that theory. Yeah,
That was so nice. Yeah, I mean, just that comparison to lizards and climate change, and
yeah.
the questions that we also engage with, but also that really interesting observation about lizards falling into like a vessel. I remember
So,
that
uh,
story.
yeah,
No,
which
no,
one?
go ahead. Because I remember one time in Mumbai, there was a lizard in the house, and I was so scared that it's gonna be in the house forever.
Oh my
Like,
gosh.
and
Yeah,
so
yeah.
I
They're
was
just,
like,
it seems like they're there all the time. Yeah, yeah.
yeah. No, go ahead. Like, how did
Yeah,
this
no, so
poem come about, Michelle?
yeah, so there was a lizard sometime back, like a lizard outside. This we have this grill. Like there's a system in Bombay where you have a window and then you also have this mosquito net
Yeah.
that's there because you have a lot of mosquitoes here. So there was a lizard that kept visiting, kind of like outside. It never entered the house, which I found very interesting. I would just keep staring at the lizard, and then I was thinking a lot about climate change, and I felt how though it's just here, I mean literally it's around us. You know that the world is going down this decline. You're not taking it seriously, or at least I didn't. I was always in this denial mode. I was always in this denial phase where okay, if it gets bad, I'll know. Why react now? So I was thinking about how the way we think about lizards, and they're everywhere, right, in Mumbai. Like for example, if they're at a distance, you're probably safe. People don't really bother lizards otherwise. I've not heard of people like chasing lizards or killing them, but it's you're always worried whether they'll fall into a dish or an open vessel, and that's when it becomes a problem. So I just kind of compared that to climate change, saying that if it probably knocks at your door, if it probably something happens to you, that's the only time you will take it seriously, probably. When you really see the effect of probably using plastic or whatever. But until then, you're still going to be in that safe space, in your bubble. So it was kind of like I wanted people to reflect on climate change. Maybe not react or maybe not act, because I of course that's an individual choice. You can't force somebody into activism. You can't force someone to react. It's a personal choice. But I thought that if I just plant that seed of thought, that would probably lead to uh, something. I think it starts with thinking.
Yeah, and I love how you deconstructed that poem to actually, tell us what you were trying to compare there. But even that little line you had about how, humans sometimes get offspring, and then once they get it, they realize what they really got into, right? So
Yeah,
I think
yeah,
climate change is a very important topic for all of us, and we don't have to wait for it to actually affect us to actually do something, right?
yeah,
But
yeah.
but amazing, so many different images in one poem. I'd love to maybe have a chat with you in the future, just deconstructing some of your poems, Michelle. That would
Oh, I
be
would love that. That's so kind of you.
that would be
Yeah.
really. But for now, I mean, thank you so much for your time, Michelle. We really, really
Thank you.
appreciate it. I think we learned so much in this conversation. Any last words, Michelle, before we summarize?
Um,
I mean, what,
no,
what
I mean,
was what was it like being on the other side? Because you're always interviewing so many
yes,
guests.
yes. It feels good. It feels great. I mean, I think an interviewer really needs to. I mean, and like I think I told you earlier, some interviews are just boring because you know that the interviewer is probably just trying to complete a target or just trying to interview you for whatever reasons. But I really love it when an interviewer takes the time to understand your thought process, and the kind of research you've done. It clearly shows. I'm a big fan of your podcast. I've seen other other shows, and I love how you deconstruct every person's thoughts. So I mean, for example, we just interview writers, right? But I love how you look at people from all kinds of backgrounds, right? So now, for example, Bound is also opening up things to like podcasters, right? So different people. I mean, you find storytellers in different formats, so videos, audios, all of that. So I would say, firstly, thank you for thinking of me for this, and for making it such an interesting chat. Like, I just felt like we are having coffee and just chatting. It didn't feel like a formal interview as such. So yeah, I mean, and then being on the other side is always better, because it shows that your work also counts, right? Because when you interview someone, you're really genuinely interested in their work and what they've done in life. So yeah, it was great.
Thanks, Michelle. I really appreciate those kind words. And hopefully, we've got you on the way up. Once you get so many more publications, I think you won't have as much time to do as many interviews. But thanks again for the listeners. Stay tuned for more such episodes from Learning Stories with more amazing guests in the near future. Until then, I highly recommend following Michelle on any social media platforms. I will link some of her websites and work in the show notes, and reach out to her, engage with her work. The conversation does not stop over here. And if possible, please do buy a copy of her wonderful poetry collection, Gulf. I know you can buy an ebook online on the Yavnika Press website.
Yes.
So I highly recommend getting that. I think it's a beautiful collection of poems that really, build on her experience growing up in the Middle East. So thank you,
Yeah,
and until next time, keep
yeah, and
learning.
I want to
Sorry.
add something. Yeah, please, for all our listeners, please do engage with Abhishek's work as well, because he's had such a rich, I would say, journey, right? And like we were saying earlier, the gap year that you've been, just that gap year itself, I think you've had so many experiences. So yeah, I would recommend all our listeners to engage with your work as well. There's so much to learn.
Thanks, Michelle.